20 years ago in Jiangning, a man was walking back to his house after using the toilet outside. What he saw shocked him.
I love stories like this. Ghost stories.
I was deadly scared. A lot of torture places, a lot of people die there.
We heard a voice.
About places we're not supposed to go. We're warned not to go. But I'm no ghost hunter. The fear, the superstition, always hides a bigger story. A true story. What really happened here? And if you knew, would you still go there? I'm Robert Joe, blogger and urban explorer. I'd been sent many reports of unexplained sightings in Nanjing. A footless girl in a black dress. A long-haired girl haunting separate universities. The rumor was this ancient capital was called something else. The City of Lost Souls. And one Nanjing district stood out more than the rest. A local resident believed that people in Jiangning were seeing spirits.
I am Yang Fan, an administrator of a Nanjing paranormal forum. Since I was a kid, my friends and family have told me many paranormal experiences. I believe they are all true. One night, 20 years ago in Jiangning, a man was walking back to his house after using the toilet outside. He saw shadows moving. So he turned back to look. There were people in army uniforms, and opposite them were civilians. The soldiers started shooting the men. The man was so frightened, he ran away.
My theory is places that attract large numbers of paranormal sightings often have things hidden in their past. Was Jiangning the site of a military base or some battle? It was one of Nanjing's 11 districts. I had arrived in the hope that by finding the abandoned compound from Yang's story, I might find some clues as to what really happened here.
All right, I think we've made it. We're on the outskirts of Jiangning. This must be the abandoned house where theoretically there was some sort of spirit sighting. I'm here to see if there is any sort of link between this building and the military and evidence of soldiers. So let's take a look around. This is pretty well destroyed. Not the type of destruction that would suggest like it was bombed out. But this has been around long enough to be pretty well messed up. Okay, it's properly dark now. I'm gonna switch to night vision. Oh, wow, this is an odd place for it to have been placed. Cassette tapes. Someone was here in the 80s. You start to sense that this was a residential building. See some proper signs of life here. A couple of chairs beat up. Newspaper stuck to a wall. You can see December 2005. There is evidence that people lived here into the 2000s. At some point after that, obviously, it's been abandoned. But I haven't found any evidence that suggests this building or this compound had any military purpose. If I lived here and I had a midnight emergency, I would want to go someplace nearby, but not bother anyone else in the area. That looks as good of a place as any. Up this area, you can see some, zoom in there. You see what looks like some rudimentary electric work. I feel like there might have been lights out here, like that right there. You can kind of imagine on that far wall there, if there was a light shining on this tree, you can kind of see here, with just a little bit of wind, this tree casts all sorts of shadows on that wall. If you're in the right mindset, maybe groggy, possibly a little drunk, those shadows could look like anything.
The man had believed he saw the spirits of soldiers. Then a similar story grabbed my attention. It was the same suburb as the last. Jiangning.
30 years ago, Jiangning was still farmland, very different from now. I had a classmate who went home for a holiday. One day, his uncle asked if he wanted to see a ghost. He said, okay. That night, around 10 p.m., his uncle led him to a field full of wild bushes. It started to rain. In front of him was a dilapidated stone bridge. He saw a group of people on the bridge as if they walked out from an unknown space. They looked half transparent. They wore army uniforms. They started marching, gradually fading and disappearing. My classmate was very scared.
Both stories from Jiangning featured soldiers. My gut was telling me it must be a war or a conflict. But which one? Nanjing was an ancient capital of China for 6 different dynasties, and the capital for the Republic of China. There were many wars to choose from. The Opium War with the British, the Sino-Japanese War, and the Chinese Civil War were all fought here. I'd returned to the area of Jiangning. Little had been gained from my first exploration. But I'd hoped that I might find a clue at the second sighting location that might connect these stories to a particular conflict or war.
So I'm here out in Jiangning, which, you know, the story that I heard took place 30 years ago, and it felt like it was going to be some sort of rural farming village with a lot of fields, and obviously a really bustling, relatively modern village here. I'll take a look, see what's going on.
The passage of time had made it hard to find things buried in the past.
Since the story takes place on a bridge, it would have to be around water. This is the only waterway I found in this area, so if I keep looking, I think it has to be somewhere around here.
It was dark, and I came across the main bridge in the area.
Well, this isn't the most exciting place to explore. I had come hoping to find something like an old stone bridge, but this is it. Nothing here gives any hint of the age. So I admit this isn't quite what I expected. You know, it's not some old stone bridge. It's pretty modern, utilitarian, concrete. But on the plus side, I see a lot of people still around, so I'll talk to them, see if they've ever heard of it. 你好。
你好。
Did you know the old stone bridge?
这个前面以前没有那种桥，这边以前是一个就是一片农田，然后就是后来盖成一栋就是过了以后盖成一种房子了，可能应该也有过吧。
I'm trying to find out about this story that takes place in Jiangning of the spirits of soldiers marching across an old stone bridge. Have you heard of this story?
是有过这个说法，以前听说过有这一段事，以前听他们老一辈说有这个事。
So a lot of people around here have seen ghosts.
对，好多人都看到的。
This was unusual. Multiple people were experiencing paranormal encounters with soldiers, all in one area. But my investigations to both locations didn't reveal any sign of military installations, past or present. I had a hunch that something sinister and dark happened here. But what conflict or war was responsible? I was in Nanjing, China, delving deep into a web of paranormal stories coming from one area, all involving soldiers. I needed to find out what battle or conflict may have inspired these sightings. Maybe the local belief system would reveal some answers. I knew one such person who connects the past life with the present. So I went in search of the local priest.
We hold this kind of ceremony every year to release the souls of restless spirits who died in Nanjing.
And what is the Chinese Buddhist belief about spirits?
We Buddhists believe in the 6 paths of reincarnation. One of them is the ghost path. Historically, especially in Nanjing, many people died unnaturally. These spirits refuse to be reborn. As Buddhist followers, we help these souls to be appeased through chanting, hoping they can transcend to the better world.
And why are there so many stories of spirit sightings here in Nanjing?
This question is related to Nanjing's history. A large number of people died here. That's why it's very common to have paranormal experiences in Nanjing.
There are stories about the sightings of soldier spirits in Jiangling. Why might that be?
Nanjing has seen many battles and wars in its history. But more civilians died here in World War II than any other wars.
So speaking with a monk, I got a sense that the Chinese Buddhist belief surrounding spirits deals with this idea that people who died a traumatic or unnatural death are stuck in between this life and the afterlife. I feel like it's also related, all of these stories, to the war history of Nanjing, so I'm going to look a little bit more into that.
The monk mentioned there were many restless souls because a lot of people had died in Nanjing over many wars. But he gave me a clue. World War II had the most dead. The Japanese invaded China in 1937 and stayed here until 1945, the end of the Second World War. It meant China was at war longer than its Western allies. I searched Nanjing's historical archives working backwards, hoping the clues from the witness testimonies could link with the real historical story in the Jiangning area. I found a story there that would shock me.
Going through these archives, I've come across an atrocity here that might be related to the story in Jiangning. It's so shocking, it's really hard to believe. A killing competition between two Japanese officers on the march into Nanjing from the southeast. This is something that I've got to look into.
The war between China and Japan broke out in July 1937. By November, Japanese troops took control of Shanghai and soon advanced onto Nanjing with over 50,000 troops. What I'd found in the city's archives revealed that two officers randomly killed anyone they came across on the march into the city.
The story was shocking even for wartime. I could understand that witnesses had seen people being killed, but how did they know what the motivations were? How did the Chinese know that these two Japanese officers were engaged in some sort of killing contest?
I connected with Chinese historian Professor Jing Shenghong, hoping he could shed some light on the killing competition.
So, Professor, I'm trying to find evidence of this so-called killing competition. Could you tell me more about it?
There were two young lieutenants in the troop. One was called Toshiaki Mukai, the other one was Tsuyoshi Noda. Their goal was to see who could be the first one that killed 100 people. When they were in Zhangzhou, they had already killed more than 50 people. On the 12th of December 1937, at Zijin Mountain in Nanjing, one had already killed 106 people, and another one killed 105 people. We don't know which one reached 100 killings first. They decided to continue the killing competition, where the winner had to kill 150 people first.
Professor Jing's account of the killing contest was vivid and detailed, but he didn't show me any proof. Could it have been something exaggerated in the fog of war? My investigation into the paranormal stories of Nanjing had been delivering new shocks at every turn. I tumbled down a rabbit hole of death and despair, exploring the story of a rumored killing contest said to have taken place here in 1937.
The details of the killing contest are terrifying to the extreme. Some of it is still quite puzzling, which means I need to speak to someone who can give a first-hand account of exactly how brutal the Japanese soldiers were.
I found an 88-year-old man who survived the Japanese assault in his hometown, Hushan village, Jiangning. This village could have been on the path of the alleged killing contest.
So what happened to the village in 1937? So what happened next?
我的小弟弟躲到那个地洞里头，跑肚子急了，跑出来屋里要煮成了早吃。我跟我的弟弟一人2人也被日本人赶到，就8个人一起。我那时候呢11岁，我那个弟弟呢3岁。我小弟弟弄贼咬日本的领把子，咬的膀子。日本人一怒之下把他拴到那个河里头淹死了。那8个大人当中有一个是我的干姑父，他见日本人这个拴死小侄儿，就大骂日本人是畜生，日本人用刀砍头砍死了。日本人就是及时行动迟到，我就喝得昏倒。我父亲的一个后头我就逃跑的。我的亲戚啊，杀的10个人，我一个身上死的，被杀的64个人。
Su Guobao's story was pretty terrifying. He saw his brother and uncle killed in front of him. He was almost killed. The brutality in which they were killed was also really striking, and I feel like it kind of reminded me of the so-called killing competition.
I was puzzled why the Japanese soldiers randomly killed innocent Chinese citizens. I called historian Rana Mitter in search of their possible motives.
Why did the Japanese kill civilians?
What we know from the eyewitness evidence at the time, that there seemed to be very little, if any, attempts by Japanese officers or by Japanese soldiers to differentiate between different sectors in the population. Let's not forget that for decades, many Japanese, including poor Japanese, have been told that they were superior to other Asians within the region, including the Chinese. So in that context, it was very hard for the Japanese to see perhaps the Chinese civilians as simply ordinary, equal civilians. And this unleashed this sort of strong, in some ways racially inflected idea that they were simply fair game.
A sense of superiority could have been a pretext for the murders of Su Guobao's family, as well as the 2 Japanese officers staging the killing contest using Chinese civilians as targets. I wanted to understand why 2 Japanese officers, men who were supposedly trained to lead and follow strict military discipline, did what they did. I needed proof that this was a premeditated contest. Professor Jing Sheng Hong had told me he had evidence of the killing contest.
Professor, this is the proof that you were talking about as far as the killing competition?
Yes. This was when those 2 fascist Japanese officers had their killing competition. A Japanese journalist followed them and reported the news. They published the story 4 times in the Japanese newspapers.
Then these are the 2 officers in question?
Yes, they were honored as warriors. But they were actually criminals that killed Chinese. Here's a book written by the famous Japanese journalist Honda Katsuichi. According to the information here, Tsuyoshi Noda, who returned to Japan after the killing competition, was giving a report. He admitted that he was in the 100 men killing competition.
That stuff in the newspapers about the brave warrior from the provinces and the brave warrior of contest to cut down 100, that's about me. The two of us did have a contest, but afterward I was often asked whether it was a big deal, and I said that it was no big deal. So, what happened to these two men after the war?
They were on trial at the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal and sentenced to death.
The story is getting stranger and stranger. You have two Japanese officers basically given free rein to go on a killing spree, which manifests as some sort of competition. And on top of that, it's glorified in the Japanese papers. Now, why would you glorify something like this, even in the context of war?
I had begun with stories of spirits of soldiers in a suburb of Nanjing, China, that led to a killing contest by Japanese soldiers in 1937. What I found was even stranger. The Japanese glorified the killing competition in the local newspapers. What was the Japanese collective psyche like in 1937? For officers to commit such a crime, and for the media to praise such acts. From the 1920s, the ultra-nationalists gained prominence in Japan. They wanted to unify Asia under their leadership against Western powers. This meant Japanese political domination of East Asia. But this imperialist policy was also a guise to grab land and set up colonies. And mainland China became a target. After the Japanese invaded China in 1937, there were reports of dozens of massacres over a 6-week period when Nanjing was first captured.
It seems clear to me that the Japanese expansion into Nanjing was extremely bloody. It was a full-on massacre, and the atrocities committed here were for some reason glorified in Japan as propaganda. And I'm trying to understand that mindset.
Well, they were in China. There is also...
I turned to Professor Tim Brooke, hoping he'd shed light on the Japanese media's role in wartime.
For sensational stories. They tried to look for stories of heroism.
Most countries' news media often play the role of a national cheerleader when they're at war. So maybe you can help me understand what role the Japanese media played in Japan's 20th century expansion.
The Japanese media in the 1930s was quite diverse, but as the military clamped down on dissenting opinion, the media largely fell into line behind the government. There is also the rather severe pressure of trying to attract readers. So journalists tended to look for sensational stories, for stories of Japanese soldiers performing superhuman tasks.
And the story of the two Japanese officers engaged in a killing competition, that fits the mold? I was shocked to find out that the Japanese newspapers glorified it as some sort of heroic deed.
This is an interesting story in how the press works during wartime. Journalists need stories that portray their side as the heroes. It's generally accepted that the 100-man killing contest, as it's called, actually happened, except for a right-wing political faction in Japan, which doesn't think Japan committed any atrocities during World War II at all. That became controversial about a decade ago when a Canadian colleague did the research and found out that, in fact, this incident may never have occurred.
This story was turning into something almost unbelievable, even for me. Soldiers killing civilians, being portrayed as heroes in Japan. But was it all true?
I'm standing here in front of blown-up versions of the actual articles printed in the Japanese papers at the time of the killing competition. These are the two men that took part. You even see the numbers listing kills per men. And yet there seems to be doubt about this story. Why is that the case?
a story of Japanese atrocities, a story of
I was following up on Tim Brooks' suggestion that there was a debate as to whether the competition had taken place at all.
They had to fall in line.
I came upon an article written by Professor Bob Wakabayashi from York University. Wakabayashi's text was intriguing. He put forward 3 main factors that suggest the competition never took place. First, the language of the reports resembles that of traditional tall tales. An example being the phrase, slicing a man in half down the middle, steel helmet and all, like a hollow bamboo stalk. Second, the Nanjing Military Tribunal records state that Noda claimed the reporters fabricated the story after Mukai had bragged about these imaginary feats, hoping the publicity would land him a better wife. And finally, both men were actually not in the infantry and would not have engaged in frontline combat.
Wakabayashi's conclusion makes an important point about the wider context. Now, he suggests the killing contest itself was a fabrication, but the debate over it raised the awareness in Japan of the Nanjing atrocity carried out by the Japanese army in the War of Imperialist Aggression. This forced post-war Japanese to confront their collective past as butchers, not just victims, in a war of aggression that began long before Pearl Harbor. Whether the killing contest was misrepresented or exaggerated or, as Wakabayashi suggests, fabricated, it doesn't matter because it was still consistent with the prevailing atmosphere, and it mirrored the state of mind that perhaps allowed these Japanese soldiers to indiscriminately slaughter the Chinese.
According to Wakabayashi, the killing contest was a fabrication. But it belied a far greater horror that went way beyond 2 officers on a killing spree. There were dozens of reports of massacres and rapes across the city.
I've gone through the historical archive, but reading about it is one thing. Seeing these graphic images in the film are a complete other experience. You just never get used to the gruesome level of violence depicted. It makes you wonder who could have ever let this happen, even within the context of war.
Seeking to understand the collective trauma in Nanjing, I'd pursued a horrific story. 2 Japanese army officers on a quest to see who could kill the most Chinese citizens. Whether the story was true or not, it led me to uncover an even more horrible crime. Japanese troops had killed tens of thousands of Chinese civilians. It wasn't a contest, it was a mass killing, labeled the Nanjing Massacre. But the final death count was still in dispute.
Following this research, there does seem to be some dispute about the final death toll. There's a number that goes as high as 300,000, and on the low end 40,000, but even the lowest number is still a terrible massacre. The question is whether this was a case of an invading army out of control or whether the atrocities were officially ordered. Who was ultimately responsible for the killing?
What happened here went beyond the rules of war. Who let these men, under the flag of the rising sun, commit such crimes? I was looking through archives to understand the chain of command in the Japanese army during the assault of Nanjing. It seemed there were technically 2 commanders. One was General Matsui Iwane, the commander of all Japanese forces in China. The other one was Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, the emperor's uncle.
There seems to have been two commanders in charge of the Japanese Imperial Army in Nanjing, General Matsui and Prince Asaka. And you have to wonder if there was some sort of conflict of power.
I had hoped that meeting with Professor Wang Wei Xing would help me figure out who was in charge.
My understanding is that there were two commanders during the invasion of Nanjing, General Matsui and Prince Asaka. I would like to know why that was the case.
Their highest commander was General Matsui, but since Asaka was a royal family member, Matsui was very respectful to him.
Perhaps you could help me understand better, why did this attack on Nanjing lead to a massacre? What made it different from the other attacks?
The Japanese massacre in Nanjing can be characterized into two types. One type is large-scale killing. After the Japanese military took over Nanjing, many Chinese soldiers couldn't back off Nanjing. On the 13th of December 1937, they started a large-scale searching and killing operation. Another type is Japanese soldiers wandering around Nanjing, committing independent acts of killing, raping, and robbery.
Was there a command to act that way, and who gave that command?
On the 12th of December 1937, the Japanese sent Troop Number 13 from Shanghai to attack Nanjing. They captured around 15,000 to 20,000 Chinese soldiers. Then they got the command to kill them all. Today, we don't have any written information to prove who gave the command, but we know this order was from the military authority in Shanghai. The commander of the Expeditionary Army was named Asaka Yasuhiko.
I had wondered why the Japanese army killed these prisoners of war. It was against international law. Then I found a clue. On August 5th, 1937, central military officials in Tokyo told their troops in China that they didn't consider the conflict a full-scale war, meaning any Chinese captured were not protected by international conventions.
At some point, there must have been a command for all of this to stop. I'm trying to figure out, when was that command given and did it work?
After Matsui found out what was happening in Nanjing, on the afternoon of the 18th, he reprimanded his subordinates. It was just a verbal warning. Nothing more was done to stop the killing.
General Matsui had made some attempt to put a stop to the massacre, but it continued, and his orders were not enforced.
My investigation here has turned darker and darker, and yet two key questions remain. In the aftermath of the Nanjing Massacre, did the Japanese face retribution or justice for the war crimes they committed? And what of the victims? How did they learn to cope with the memories of what they had lived through?
I'd found the reason why some people called Nanjing the City of Lost Souls. Shortly before World War II, the Japanese military had committed a massacre here of incomprehensible proportions. It was time to find out if justice had been served to the persecutors of this tragic event. I had visited the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall to find out what happened to the Japanese military commanders, General Matsui and Prince Asaka, after the war.
This is General Matsui standing in front of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. The tribunal found that he knew what was happening during the Nanjing Massacre, and he failed to put a stop to it and was ultimately responsible. They found him guilty, they sentenced him to death, and they executed him.
Prince Asaka as well as Emperor Hirohito were not prosecuted, in part due to the pact that granted the imperial family immunity from prosecution at the end of World War II. In the fog of war, it's never easy to find the truth. But I'd gone some way into uncovering what had really happened here and why the killings took place. But I'd not yet understood how the living had survived.
So the trauma of the Nanjing Massacre, how has that affected the survivors and their families?
The Nanjing Massacre has been the most tragic event in the city's history. Nanjing itself is a city of sadness. Although half a century has passed, on the surface, the people of Nanjing have seemingly forgotten about this matter. But the memory of the massacre is always in the air. When small scuffles between China and Japan happen, Nanjing will immediately be remembered.
So, how have the people of Nanjing coped since then?
Life is very fragile, but we have to look forward. To be able to look forward, we need an ending to the past. I think for the victors and the victims to resolve the issue, there must be a prerequisite, a sincere apology.
Before I left the city, I visited the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall one last time. It turned out to be an auspicious day. Tomb cleaning day, a Chinese tradition to remember the day. Su Guobao, whose family were killed by the Japanese, showed me their tomb.
This one up here? You saw the names of your relatives. Just how did that make you feel? The story of the Nanjing Massacre is more brutal and tragic than I could have ever imagined. It's a complex story about a campaign of terror and fear and propaganda that still hasn't been fully resolved. The war may have been over for 70 years, but the grief still remains.